Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, I'm joined by Josho Brouwers, Dahm, McCaffery, Owen, Rees and Roel. We're looking at Ancient Warfare magazine volume 10, issue 1, the conflict between Sparta and Athens, the Archidamian Wars. We've had a few questions which were posted for us on Facebook. You can find the magazine online at ancient-warfare.com or search Facebook for Ancient Warfare magazine. We tend to put out a call for questions a week or so before we do the recording. So guys, let's start at the beginning. The Archidamian War is the first act of the Peloponnesian War. We have two rival power blocks. I wonder if someone could set the scene.
Basically, as soon as the Persian Wars end or as the Persian invasion is defeated, tension starts to rise between Athens and Sparta. Because Athens at this point has taken over the naval alliance that is trying to push the Persians back. And the Spartans are really concerned about the rise of this new power that is, going to eventually start forcing its allies back into the alliance, start transforming this alliance into its own empire. And already in 479 there's tension over the fact that the Athenians are rebuilding their city walls, which the Spartans had rather they didn't. And it sort of keeps on building from there. And the further problem is that the Athenian expansion or the rise of the Athenian Empire also clashes with the interests of one of Sparta's prime allies, Corinth, which actually leads, after a few decades, to what's called the First Peloponnesian War. And we haven't really covered that at all, I think, in the volume. But this is the first time that Athens and Sparta are formally at war. But in this war, Sparta really takes a back seat. They don't really care to commit themselves. Most of the fighting is between Corinth and Aegina and Athens. And they are having this sort of little wars of rivalry. And it seems for a while that Athens is doing really well. They conquer Boeotia, they conquer Euboea. They ravage Aegina and remove them from the power balance. But eventually Sparta does appear. At the Battle of Tanagra, they crush the Athenians. The Athenians try to then recover their losses, but eventually they have to acknowledge that the Spartans basically have them down for the count and they have to make peace. At that point, Athens and Sparta conclude a 30-year truce, which is in 446. And they start to try and see how they can continue in this world with the Athenian power bloc now very firmly established, but the Spartans in no way weakened from their previous conflict. And throughout the final couple of, the decade and a half before the Peloponnesian War actually begins, Athenian power is more or less constantly there. And increasingly, the allies of Sparta feel that this affects their interests, and that Athenian interests spreading across the Aegean and Western Greece really means that they have fewer and fewer options to make their own voice heard, and that it really affects the power balance that they would like to retain. And so they are putting increasing pressure on Sparta to eventually actually bring their weight to bear and go to war against Athens to try and break this empire. Because at this point, there's no longer any question that the Athenian Empire is an empire. The Athenians speak about their former allies as our subjects. They are levying tribute every year. They're using that tribute to their own ends to build their own great, building projects of Pericles, the Parthenon. They're using it to fund their fleet and to keep it constantly going about the Aegean and across the Ionian Sea as well, to try and secure Athenian interests. So there are a couple of occasions when this leads to direct conflict towards the 430s. The first of that is when Kerkyra, basically modern Corfu, makes an alliance with Athens, which goes against the interests of Corinth. The Corinthians go to war. The Athenians send ships in support. There's a big naval battle at Sybota, which the Corcyraeans win. And at that point, obviously, Corinth is severely sort of annoyed that their interests have been checked in Western Greece. And then a city on the Chersonese, so in Thrace, in the northern Aegean, called Potidaea, revolts against the Athenian Empire. The Corinthians cannot openly support them because Athens is at war with them. It would lead to escalation. So instead they send volunteers. They send a force of volunteers over to go and reinforce the Potidaean rebels. The Athenians see this as a provocation, but the Corinthians also see the Athenian siege of that city then as a provocation and as a direct attack on Corinthian interests. So at this point the Corinthians go and complain to Sparta. At that point, Spartans have already been, hearing this constant earful of the Aeginetans who were beaten in the previous war about how they want their home back, how the Athenians have taken over their land and have done them injustice. And they're also getting an earful from the Megarians, who, because they betrayed Athens in the previous war, they have been blocked out of all the ports of the Athenian Empire. So there's a trade embargo on that. So all these different allies are complaining to Sparta and saying, look guys, you really have to do something now, otherwise we're never going to get to stop Athenian power, and eventually it's going to consume even you. And at that point, eventually Sparta realizes that it's going to have no choice. If it wants to look credible to its allies, it's going to have to fight for its interests. It's going to have to go to war.
That was comprehensive.
It's only touched upon in the issue itself for reasons of space, of course, because what we try to do with ancient warfare is to make all the issues as focused as possible on the particular theme, because we'll probably want to revisit stuff at a later date, and the First Peloponnesian War and the whole aftermath of the Persian Wars, and indeed the Persian Wars themselves, because we never really dealt with them except in my book and in the Marathon special.
And what's your book called, Josho?
I want to plug my book. It's Henchman of Ares, but it's also an ancient warfare special technically. So it's.
I thought you were going to give us a Spanish title.
Oh yeah, it's available in Spanish now also. While we're plugging this, and the Ionian revolt. That's the only bits that we've dealt with. We haven't really gone into the Persian Wars in great depth, and also not in the period between, let's say, the Persian Wars up until the let's say the Second Peloponnesian War, which is what we're talking about now, the first half, simply because we want to revisit that in later issues of Ancient Warfare, and I have something planned for volume 12 already for Ancient Warfare. So, but yeah, rules rundown is very comprehensive as far as that is concerned.
Is comprehensive a bad word? Because I'm not sure what you're saying.
No, comprehensive is a good word.
You mean as in tediously overly detailed and overlong? Yes.
No, but it really sets the stage. I mean, it's after the Persian Wars are over, you basically have the Greeks struggling amongst themselves, and the Persians sometimes fanning the flames as well.
And I mean, that's one of the things is, of course, Thucydides sees the conflict between the two city-states as inevitable, that their rise to power meant they would have to clash. So, you know, and one of his justifications is that he thinks that this is the greatest war ever fought. And he goes to great lengths to show that this is a greater war than the Persian Wars were, which is, taken as a dig at Herodotus, because you have these two great powers that were at the height of their powers at the outbreak of the Second Peloponnesian War, and basically it's an inevitable struggle, but it's also it's a, not to use the analogy of a world war, but it's basically a world war within Hellas, because it ranges all of the Greek states against one another on either side.
And Thucydides isn't a neutral participant in this, of course. Isn't neutral in this at all. I mean, he has there's a certain moralistic bent also to his writing, particularly as far as Athens is concerned, which, the feeling is, and you can see that in Herodotus also a little bit, the feeling is that Athens is perhaps, overreaching itself. Yeah,
and there is a very strong strand in Thucydides, of course, of trying to sketch these two powers as being opposites in every way. So Sparta is sketched as sort of very traditional, slow-moving, conservative land power that has a traditional alliance network of other powers around it, whereas Athens is the quintessential sea power, which has a large alliance of subject allies all across the Aegean and across the sea. And it's very aggressive and very ambitious and very, innovative and things like that. So he's trying to sketch these two sort of, he's basically trying to sketch a clash between an immovable object and an unstoppable force. And trying to see, to try and phrase that whole conflict in those terms.
Did war need to break out? Because Sparta did make overtures, but Pericles refused.
Yeah, so what happens is that several times, Sparta is clearly very reluctant to go to war. In particular, the Spartan king Archidamus, who ended up being the person who the war is named after, the Archidamian War. He is very reluctant to try and fight Athens because he believes that this is not going to go well. Sparta lacks the resources to do it, and if you go into a prolonged war with a strong power, you're going to lose control over what happens very quickly. So he's trying to sort of do anything he can to prevent this war from breaking out. And one of the things that he does is he keeps sending one embassy after another to Athens to try and parley with them and see if there is some way that they can submit their differences to arbitration, or see if there is some other way that they can arrange that the conflict doesn't need to actually come to blows. But every time they're basically sent away after the Athenians won't listen. The Athenians do not want to negotiate concerning their empire. They want to keep it. And in particular, Pericles is the strong voice in this, who keeps saying, like, we don't want to listen to your offers. We don't want to negotiate about this. If you're objecting to our empire, come and basically, come and take it if you want. And the interesting thing is Thucydides is obviously very full of praise of Pericles. He's Pericles' biggest fan. He wants to sketch him as the greatest statesman ever and the architect of Athenian power. But there are other traditions that we find in Diodorus and that we find in Plutarch and that we find even in Aristophanes that basically say what's going on here is Pericles is making this war happen. He's steering us towards war. And if it weren't for Pericles, maybe we would have found some common ground. We would have been able to negotiate about things, and we would have taken the fuse out of this powder box.
There is an underlying problem with Thucydides, especially at the beginning of this period, where he's very anti-Corinth, especially as a naval power. There's a brilliant article by Mackenzie and Hannah, which reassesses Thucydides' own assessment of Corinthian naval power. And one of the sort of underlying arguments is that Corinth as a naval power was the only thing close enough to matching Athens at the time, and Corinth was the major problem. And when the threat came from Corinth taking control of Corcyra over an issue with a small polis further north, Epidamnus, there was now a great concern because the two combined fleets of Corcyra and Corinth could match numerically and experientially the Athenians. So although Thucydides spends a lot of time focusing on Sparta and Athens, if you look at it from a Corinthian-Athenian point of view, it comes very close to war being inevitable, and the question is, would Sparta get involved?
Yeah, I tried to highlight this in the overview that I offered, but basically, when you really look at it, the war is always between Corinth and Athens, and Sparta is reluctantly dragged into it. But of course, Sparta was the only force that was considered to be able to make a real fist against Athens, and Corinth was always going to need the Spartans to support them in that conflict. So the whole crucial point is whether the Corinthians could persuade the Spartans to declare war on their side.
Which, to begin with, they couldn't. There's a lot of back and forth to Sparta. Corinth would start grabbing as many Spartan allies as they could to back up their claim, and Sparta just keep rebuffing them between 433, especially around 433. They just keep rebuffing them and say no. We can find another way. So Roel's absolutely right. They're really dragging their feet on it.
So is that a literary patterning from Thucydides, though? Is that like I want to frame this war as Sparta versus Athens, therefore I'll ignore the truth of the matter and the rise of Corinthian naval power and present it in this this artificial, the great naval power versus the great land power and all the contrast between Athens and Sparta, because an Athens versus Corinth focused piece of literature wouldn't fall into those sort of beautiful patterns.
I would argue that that's probably true in the sense that when you look at the actual events of the Archidamian War, again, just like with the First Peloponnesian War, the Spartan commitment is minimal. It's as small as it can be. And the real fighting for those early years is very much being done by the Corinthian fleet and Corinthian expeditionary forces in western Greece. And so even when the Spartans do declare war, it seems that their own commitment to it is as minimal as they can get away with without looking towards their allies, without looking like weaklings, basically, without looking like they're dragging their feet. But they're really trying to get out of their obligation of having to fight this war.
The other issue, just to correct something that was said, is actually when you look at it, the rising naval power was Athens, not Corinth. Corinth was an established naval power before the Persian Wars.
So it's about how Athens as a new massive empire is going to slot into the existing power balance of Greece as it was.
But certainly, I mean, even Herodotus paints Athens as the naval power par excellence.
No, it becomes the naval power par excellence because of the wooden walls the old wooden walls.
Yeah, and I mean even the silver mines at Laurion to allow them to build their fleet. And again that comes down to the whole Themistocles and the panegyric to Themistocles that is Herodotus.
Yeah, so there's an important point there that Hans von Wees has argued in his recent book, where he says it's actually not true that Themistocles built the whole fleet. It's probably true that he may have doubled the fleet using that money, but it was already there, and Athens was already a naval power before 483. So there is a sense in which Herodotus is definitely selling the narrative that Themistocles made Athens a naval state, but that's actually not the case. Like, they were already growing, they were already building, and which is why they had that ancient rivalry with Aegina, which is, you know, a major sea power that's just off the coast from Athens.
There's a mention in Citadis that it's not like a trireme fleet at that stage, and so could it be Themistocles brings in trireme fleet as such, changes the style of the ships?
Yeah, arguably. I mean, I think there is some evidence that they already had triremes before that time. I mean, they would be late to the party if they only switched at 483, but it is possible. Certainly they were not very experienced with triremes, which you can see from, you know, crude tactics that they applied in the Persian Wars.
I'm just trying to think. You also have they didn't send triremes to Ionia during the revolt either. So whilst they did have a naval, well, it's debatable. The word that Herodotus uses is in no way discernible as what we would now describe as a trireme. He uses the more.
Pentecontes and Samian Pentecontes seem to be the dominant ship, don't they? Because he talks about this. He talks about the Samian as a development of Polycrates of Samos, as a development to the Pentaconta.
There's a lot of weird stuff in Herodotus because he's writing at a time when essentially what we understand as classical Greek warfare seems to have crystallized, but he's writing about a period in which it hasn't yet. And there seems to be some confusion where sometimes he's projecting things back, sometimes he is representing them as he heard them, and it's not always clear which it is. So I would be hesitant to say, like, oh, this is what we can tell from Herodotus about the equipment that they were using, the kind of ships that they had, or anything like that.
So those comments we made on Thucydides and the caveats we need to take into regard, do they affect his reliability? Because obviously he's traditionally in modern scholarship seen as the scientific historian par excellence, but perhaps not is all as it seems.
There are no scientific historians as such, neither ancient nor modern.
Well, no. It was funny. I went to a fascinating paper presented by a surgeon who basically went through all of the description of the plague and compared it to his experiences, and he was full of praise for the observational skill of Thucydides.
There is a lot of probably rightful praise for Thucydides as being a very detached observer who seems to give us a lot of meaningful detail about the events that he describes. But to say that he is the first scientific historian, that he's purely rational, and that he's so much superior to Herodotus or to later authors like Xenophon or Diodorus, I mean, it's very doubtful simply because we have so few examples to compare him to, and also because given that he is the main and only source for a lot of the things he described, how can we tell whether he's being objective or whether he's hiding his bias behind a veneer of supposed authority? I mean, that seems to be very much what he's doing.
He admits to himself as well. In his opening statements, he basically says that he's putting in what he thinks is best and what he thinks probably happened.
And in a sense, I mean, Herodotus is often blamed for presenting several different accounts of something and failing to choose between them. But in a way, he's being more honest. He's saying, like, I've heard these separate things. I don't know which one is true. Whereas Thucydides pretends there is no doubt, gives you one account, doesn't tell you where he got it, just assumes that you'll trust his word on it. And in a sense, like, we do, and this is why Thucydides is regarded as a better historian. But if we didn't, then he would be a terrible historian, because he doesn't write footnotes. He doesn't tell you where he got his stuff.
No, but Herodotus is not really isn't really a proper historian. He's more an investigative journalist, as Jona Lendering would describe him. And I always thought that it was very apt for Herodotus, at least, because he goes somewhere, he talks to people, and then he transcribes their stories, and he says, well, this is what they tell me. Who knows? Whereas Thucydides does what most ancient historians do. They hear a lot of stuff, they read a lot of stuff, and then they say, okay, well, this sounds most plausible to me, and I'm not going to give you my reasons. It's a little bit the Victor Davis Hanson approach to writing history. There I said it again.
Later sources often get blamed, like Xenophon in particular often gets blamed for things that he leaves out. But of course, this also happens with Thucydides. Like, he very famously doesn't give the Persians much of a role at all, even though, especially towards the Decalaean War, which we're not going to talk about today, but the Persians have a very strong role, and he just ignores it. And so we always have to wonder when we're looking back over every part of his account, like, what is he not telling us? Which parts is he leaving out? Because he doesn't think that it feeds into, as you said, his story of this is the greatest war ever.
Well, it's also noticeable that what he spends a lot of time dwelling on. Some of it's very useful, very revealing, but as much as I love him, Thucydides spends a very long time on a non-royal Spartan called Brasidas, who just so happens to have beaten him at Amphipolis, and he sort of pushed forward as arguably the greatest general, at least during the Archidamian War, rather conveniently.
Well, you'd have to beat me, wouldn't you? Surely.
There's a really interesting article on that subject in the issue. Did you know, Owen?
By a really good guy, a really talented writer.
There's a question. There's a question coming through on the feed right now. His name is Rowan Essay, and you know he's full of praise of this article. It's amazing.
No, I've always felt that Thucydides' account of his own campaign, in which he completely failed and was subsequently exiled from Athens, it's very exemplary of how you can write something about you that must have been, in his case, very emotionally difficult, and that he wrote it entirely in a detached way, sort of saying like, this is what happened, this guy failed, etc. But at the same time, because of the way he sets up that narrative, as you said, with a massive focus on Brasidas, and someone else who, Sonia Nevin, has argued actually that he makes a huge case over the campaign at Delion that happened around the same time, saying, oh, these are the moments when the Athenian Empire was really hurt. He's setting up the story in such a way that his own failure is diminished in various ways, both by saying, oh, Brasidas is the best general ever, so of course I lost, and also saying like there were more important things going on at the same time, so it didn't matter that much that I lost there. It mattered much more the Athenians lost at Delion, things like that.
You say he's detached, but when is he actually writing this stuff? Because a lot of it seems to have been revised and reviewed, whatnot, later on. I mean, if he is detached, it could be 10 years later that he's penning that.
No, it's true. It's an open question. The composition of the whole thing is clearly he started writing at the beginning of the war, and he kept on writing all the way through, and he was writing afterwards as well because he knew when it ended. We don't know exactly which parts were written when. There's a lot of debate over whether Book 8 is actually unfinished. Of course, the whole work is unfinished, we know, because it stops mid-sentence. So there's a lot of question about what the actual writing process was, and unfortunately we can never answer those.
I mean, from my personal perspective, it's annoying that he doesn't mention Socrates, but,
Not everyone has to mention Socrates.
Yes, they do. They must. Everyone else does.
Should we go to a question from the Facebook? Our friend Facebook Stuart asks, could Sparta have ended the Academian War early if Academius hadn't delayed somewhat at the onset?
I'm not sure if I understand exactly what that means, but we were talking earlier about the fact that Archidamus was very reluctant to go to war. So he was perhaps holding it off. And if the Spartans had declared the war several years earlier, would it have been easier for them to win? I don't think so, to be honest, because the infrastructure with which the Athenians made the Spartan strategy futile was already there. It was there. It was built in, like, the long walls were built in the early 450s. Pericles was in charge. Everything was as it was a few years later. So I don't see how it would have made much of a difference.
Was the Spartan reluctance to get involved also the reason for the sort of there's debate about how devastating the invasions of Attica were, but could they have been ramped up slightly, or were they part of the Spartan reluctance as well, that they were sort of just going through the motions rather than actually committing to a invasion? It's not until the second phase of the war when they make a base in Decalaea. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's perhaps not the typical opinion that scholars hold, but I think the idea of invading Attica every year with a massive army is meant to be a minimal effort. I mean, they're basically saying we're going to go in with an army that's so large they're never going to fight us. which Thucydides says explicitly Archidamus doesn't expect the Athenians to come and fight him. So they can just march through, they have lots and lots of guys, bring all their stuff with them so that they can ravage as much as they can and then go home again. They know it's not very effective. They know the Athenians don't care because they're stuck behind their walls and they can bring in as much food as they like because they've got the money, they've got the empire to support themselves. So they're just doing a sort of symbolic form of harm. And this, I mean, it really matters, of course, to the local population in Attica, and we really mustn't pretend that this is ineffectual. It really matters a lot to that population. But the question is to what extent that was a real commitment to this war by Sparta. It has even been suggested that if they went with a smaller army, they might have actually gotten the battle that they wanted, so that they deliberately took as many men as they could so that that battle wouldn't happen. They wouldn't have to fight, they wouldn't have to risk everything. So there is a real sense that, you know, the Spartans were still just not that into it. They were not really bothering with it. And of course, you know, in the second phase of the war, when they do build a fortress in Attica, it becomes much more effective, and their raiding goes all year round, and they're crippling the Athenian economy. Allowing all the slaves to run away. They're crippling the Athenian cavalry from overuse. So then it becomes a really important, a really decisive strategy.
But it's not just for the benefit of Sparta, is it? In terms of actually affecting these invasions, it's for the benefit of their alliance system as well. I mean, it's bringing out their allies and getting them involved, and then getting them, you know, how can I say, effectuating the actual alliance pledges.
Well, you could also never underestimate the impact it has on military morale. You actually see it in Athens when it's about 431. So Potidaea, the siege of Potidaea has been going on 2 years. Pericles has his system inside the walls, and people just focus on that. Whereas in 431, they had 3,000 men committed at Potidaea, and they levy what's called a pandemi, so a mass levy, and 10,000 Athenian hoplites go and ravage Megara after Attica had just been ravaged by Sparta.
But they're doing that twice every year, aren't they? At that stage.
At the beginning, it is mentioned, but there are only 2 instances we're actually given the figures, and they are always this sort of high level, nearing 10,000 men, taking account.
No, more important than the 10,000 hoplites is the innumerable light troops that are sent along with that. Like, it's a pandemic levy.
Numbered rule.
No, but this is really important. Like, Thucydides refuses to mention a number because, you know, he doesn't care. But this is the real thing about a pandemic levy. It's not just your hoplites and your cavalry, it's everyone. So all the people who can afford that kind of equipment, they're going as well. So it's an enormous number of men that are sent out to Megara.
But they're doing that twice every year, aren't they, at that stage?
No, absolutely.
And then, of course, Pericles also leads a fleet around the Peloponnese and ravages everywhere he goes. So he takes like 120 ships or 150 triremes. It's a crazy number of ships. He takes this massive fleet. And just
plus the 100 he already had.
Yeah, and just goes and burns down everything he can.
By what is it, 427, he has 250 triremes at sea. It's phenomenal.
It's crazy. I mean, the commitment of Athens is beyond doubt. They are really throwing everything they have into it.
Comes back to Roel's point earlier. It's very easy to sort of pinpoint Sparta dragging their feet, and you sort of go, well, look at the resources Athens was capable of throwing at them within 5 years. You're talking with these armed forces all over their empire, plus a good 10,000 still in the city, or available within Attica, plus 250 triremes. No Greek state could produce 250 triremes other than Athens. It's a phenomenal enterprise.
Well, yeah, a viable long-term strategy if this, you know, if it dragged on. I mean, how long can you give up your territory for beyond your walls, which is essentially what they were doing, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental, so the Periclean strategy, or the island strategy as it's also called, is the idea that the Athenians could simply abandon their countryside to the enemy, withdraw within their walls, and because of their long walls that led to their harbour in Piraeus, they were able to import food from across their empire and beyond, from the Black Sea region, which they could pay for by the tribute that was being paid by their subordinate allies, and so that they would never suffer starvation or deprivation because of the enemy raids. This worked in theory, and for a long time the Athenians were not really in any danger of starvation. The only problem is that it was a very severe tax on the power of Pericles, essentially, because people didn't like this stuff happening. Of course, it was their farms being ravaged, their fields being ravaged, their farms, houses being burned down, stripped of any valuables. You know, they had to huddle together in the city and watch it happen. So there was an immense amount of frustration. There was an immense sense of like not the impotence, essentially, just not being able to strike back at an obvious enemy who was obviously doing you harm. And so this actually called Pericles' strategy into question, and he had to really pull out all the stops to try and prevent his citizens from repealing his strategy and going out to fight these people. So there was a way in which it sort of put a lot of pressure on the moral and personal or emotional reserves of the Athenians, even if it didn't harm them in a physical sense.
It's not just also the people of Attica that are coming inside the walls. You've got refugees coming from other cities, because we hear about the people from Potidea actually taking refuge in Athens during this time as well, leaving just the army as such to defend Potidea. And I think that's replicated elsewhere.
Yeah, the people of Potidea, and it must have been an enormous operation, because also all of the livestock in Attica had been moved to Euboea, just to make sure that it was out of the Spartans' reach. So there was an enormous logistical operation going on to make sure that it would all be okay. And these people were living in absolutely squalid conditions within the long walls, as the Citadis describes. They were living in hovels or in towers of the wall, or in the space between the long walls where there was basically nothing, and they just had to build a shanty town there for the duration. But the thing is, we should probably picture this as a summer thing only, so they would just be able to go back during their farms most of the year, because the Spartans were not going to come back. So in a sense, it's mitigated by the fact that the Spartans just weren't committed to making the countryside completely inaccessible to us.
It's only over 40 to, I think, 70 days is the longest attack, isn't it? By during the Archidamian War.
Is it 70? 40 days, I think, is the longest.
40 days, but then I thought there was an extended one when they occupy... Sorry, it's the attack on Potidea itself that is said to be 70 days of constant attack and whatnot. So,
you mean Plataea, actually.
What I'm saying, not Potidea, sorry, Plataea, sorry. Mixing around here. Yeah.
No, you're right. That's the longest one, but then, they are already having trouble because they can't live off the land. They have to bring their supplies, which kind of shows how ineffective this ravaging is, because they can't even scrape enough stuff together to feed themselves. And so once their food runs out, they have to go.
Was the countryside completely abandoned?
Well, this is what I'm saying, probably not, in the sense that the population was clearly driven into the city for the duration of these invasions, but we don't know if maybe people would presumably go back out to their farms during the winter, because why would they stay in the city? It made no sense.
They didn't have mobile troops harrying them, or...
Oh, you mean in that sense? Yeah, no, this is absolutely true. Like during the invasions as well, the Athenian cavalry in particular was very active, and it very much limited the extent to which the Peloponnesians could actually ravage the countryside, because every time they sent out light troops or sent men away from their army train to go and try and burn down farms and trample crops, the Athenian cavalry would swoop down on them. And there are actually encountered clashes between the Boeotian and the Athenian cavalry during this stage. Even if the Athenians are supposedly not engaging the Peloponnesians, the cavalry is fighting constantly to minimize the damage the Peloponnesians are doing.
Samuel from Facebook asked, does cavalry at this point become more important? Which presumably is yes.
Based on the idea it wasn't important.
Exactly. No, this is the thing.
When needs must, you produce it from nowhere kind of thing, though, don't you?
No, this is the thing. Cavalry was always important in Greek warfare. There is never a point at which cavalry is suddenly not important. The Athenians had cavalry all the way back into Solon's time. They had a corps of cavalry that they had organized. It's just most of the time from the Archaic period, they were relying on the Thessalians and their allies to supply them with cavalry forces at need. But when they could no longer rely on that, they immediately started building their own cavalry corps. And the thing is that the Athenians were doing this long before they went to war with Sparta, or during the First Peloponnesian War, when Spartan invasions were not really a threat until the very end. So they were already aware of the fact that this was going to be tactically and strategically useful to them before the time, or long before the time of the Spartan invasions. And in fact, the cavalry corps they raised was 1,000 men strong, in addition to 200 horse archers that they kept on as mercenaries, which, based on the population of Athens, is vast cavalry force. It's an enormous cavalry force. There is absolutely no way that any other state, as far as I know, in history, was able to mount that large a force of cavalry for its own defense. Simply in demographic terms, it's every single man who could afford to be a horseman in Athens was made a horseman. It's an enormous force. And they were using this because the Boeotians were doing the same thing, and they had to defend against that invasion force. So cavalry is absolutely an important element in Greek warfare, and the Peloponnesian War is merely evidence of that.
And I think it's one of those problems of the literature which emphasises heavy infantry, and doesn't mention light forces and doesn't mention numbers. That when you look at Attic art, the horse is the most dominant feature in pottery and depictions, and we've got so many mentions of hippias and all these other horse-based elements in society, even when they are heavy infantry, like the bodyguard of the Spartan king, that they clearly had some kind of cavalry origin. So cavalry's there, but it's not emphasized.
And cavalry is all over the place. I mean, this is the thing, like, only the Peloponnese doesn't seem to use cavalry for a while, but even then they have units like the Hippies. But cavalry is everywhere else. The Boeotians are famous for cavalry, the Thessalians are famous for cavalry. There are several cities in Asia Minor that are famous for cavalry, which they learned from the Lydians, who are famous for cavalry. The Sicilians are famous for cavalry, the southern Italian Greeks are famous for cavalry, the Macedonians are famous for cavalry. Everybody has cavalry and uses it, except for a few states in the Peloponnese. But if we keep focusing on them, then we seem to think, there's no cavalry in all this. What you mentioned, Murray, is that the Thucydides often talks about hoplites only, or talks only about heavy troops. But the thing is, he would never neglect to mention cavalry. He always specifies how many there are.
Well, I think Thucydides is better than most, because he mentions light troops and cavalry far more often than, Herodotus, for instance, and even Diodorus, who just mentions the number of hoplites.
Well, Diodorus is also hoplites and cavalry, usually. But no, I mean, Thucydides gets obsessive about it, especially in his narrative of the Sicilian expedition, just how many there are and where they're coming from. And this is very much on the level of Xenophon later on, who's obsessed with cavalry. So it's a very, very important part of Greek warfare. You really have to acknowledge that. And in this case, it really comes out because one of their main roles was to preserve the countryside.
One of our problems is we often have to extrapolate numbers out because of very limited information. You get the Plataean ratio of Helot to Spartiate, and that's used all the time. It's like, well, it must be 7 per man. And you're like, well, no, not necessarily.
Well, numbers of light troops are a whole other matter, of course, and we rarely get them. Even Thucydides clearly doesn't care.
Well, it's interesting. Again, at Sphacteria, he mentions there's 800 hoplites, 800 light troops. So he sort of goes into specifics, but it's very rare you get specifics like that.
It's often because they're a small corps of specialists.
Yeah, most of the time Thucydides is rather dismissive about the light troops. He just sort of says, well, there's the battle is about to happen, and first you have the light troops, and they sort of, they harass each other, but then the real battle happens between...
Well, no, I mean, that happens once. That's one battle in which he does that, and every other occasion when light troops...
That's the thing that's taken as typical.
No, of course it is. We're doing ancient history here. One is basically universal law.
Exactly.
No, but this is the thing. Like, this is actually really important because Thucydides once says something disparaging about light troops, and this has been extrapolated to say, they didn't care. None of the Greeks cared about light troops. They had no role to play. But everywhere else in Thucydides, he makes it very clear how powerful light troops are. And you have the Battle of Spartalos, the Battle of Stratos, the Battle of, in Aetolia, Demosthenes, the Battle of Sphacteria, where light troops completely trounce hoplites. And Thucydides describes in detail how they do it. So he's clearly very impressed with their capabilities. There's no doubt about it that he's very impressed with the ability of light troops when they have some kind of either numbers or specialism or, when they're just in the right tactical situation. But in a pitched battle between lines of hoplites, there's just not much room for them to do anything.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, that those lessons aren't really learned until Iphicrates, for instance, in the Athenian sense, the power of light troops and his peltasts.
Well, no. Again, it's very clear from Thucydides that he knows what he's talking about when he's talking about light troops. And Demosthenes very much picks this up and uses his light troops on Sphacteria to decide the battle. So the idea that, we had to wait until Iphicrates in the 390s before we actually get some good use of light troops, it's nonsense. I mean, he didn't just sort of go up to the Athenian assembly being sort of in his early 20s and say, look guys, you know what you should do? You should give me 1,200 peltas and they'll win the war for you. No, they obviously knew this was going to work. Otherwise they would never have invested in it.
I think we need to extrapolate that therefore the light troops let Thucydides down when he was fighting Brasidas. That's clearly what happened.
Well, he was fighting in Thrace, so peltas would have been a very important part of this environment in which he worked. I mean, sure, Owen can tell us about their role in Brasidas' campaign.
Well, you also have the other issue with Thucydides, especially, because you got to ask questions of why he leads one event from another in such detail. So Demosthenes is given a huge backstory in Aetolia to almost explain why he uses light armed troops at Sphacteria. So the question there, and this is a question, is, do you think that's Thucydides explaining something strange, or just relating a year before and he was just interested in it? And actually the light armed troops is a constant already.
I mean, there's definitely evidence from before that light armed troops are effective. So it's not like Demosthenes had to learn this suddenly by doing it. You know, Thucydides describes a battle during the First Peloponnesian War in which Athenian light troops cornered a fleeing unit of Corinthians and just sort of had lined up some hoplites to keep them blocked in a field, surrounded by ditches, and just stoned them to death. So the effect of light troops there is very clearly present. And then in 429 at Spartalos, the Athenians send a force out to go and back up their troops in Potidaea. They go and engage some local troops. They defeat the hoplites easily, but their own cavalry and light troops get defeated. And as a result, the enemy, which still has cavalry and light troops, they just wipe out those hoplites, and they lose 20% of their men and all their generals. So there's very, very high losses. And you know, there are several occasions before Demosthenes goes into Aetolia in which light troops clearly are the decisive force. So I don't believe that story that Demosthenes had to learn the effect of light troops. In fact, in that very account, when Demosthenes marches into Aetolia, Thucydides says he's waiting for his allies from Phocis because they were supposed to help him out, because Thucydides says they were the right kind of troops for this terrain. They thought they would be very useful. But his allies from Naupactus were urging him on, and his Aetolian allies were saying, you need to go now, otherwise the chance is going to pass. And so he decided to march out without the troops that he needed. So there's an awareness there already that, you know, you need particular troops for particular situations. You can't just rely on hoplites.
Yeah, and it's also reminiscent of, with Thucydides' figures at the beginning of the war. They have that rather anomalous 1,600 archers in Athens that very rarely get mentioned ever again, but appear a lot in epigraphy. Archers quite often appear next to hoplites and cavalry within epigraphic evidence, but very rarely appear individually within the historians.
Well, it's assumed, right, that they are part of the trireme crews, so they are the archers that fight on the deck of the triremes. Just like Polycrates of Samos a century earlier is said to have 1,000 mercenary archers, which are also supposed to man his fleet, which is where they go, supposedly. But yeah, I mean, Demosthenes in Aetolia, again, has those archers with him, the archers that came with him on the ships. So he has 300 hoplites and something like 100 archers or something. And he says that the Athenians were actually doing all right in this situation where they were surrounded on all sides by local light troops and they were being beset by them and they had no way out. But they were doing all right as long as the archers had arrows. And as soon as they run out, everything goes to hell.
Should we go through another Facebook question? I think we've answered. Brian asked on Facebook. Brian asked a question about light infantry. I'm sure we've more than answered that. But to what extent was the war characterised by raiding rather than necessarily big set piece battles? Asked Rudolph.
Yeah, no, very much. I mean, ultimately, the entire Spartan strategy comes down to raiding, effectively. And the Athenian counter-strategy also was not about trying to force a pitched battle, but in trying to do as much damage as possible by sudden invasions, by, you know, moving along the coast, trying to attack whatever was convenient. So the entire way that these two powers are trying to approach this war is essentially a glorified cattle raid. And we see this happening even on the smaller scale, where in Aristophanes there's a famous scene where suddenly the general Lamachus shows up, wounded from trying to defend the border of Attica against the Boeotians. And we never hear in Thucydides about the Boeotians separately and by themselves attacking Athenian territory, but it must have happened all the time because they're right on the border. And all they do is just sort of march in every now and then, take some cattle, maybe burn some farms, and then they leave again. So raiding is very much the background noise of this entire war, and the occasional battle is really only the exception.
It's pretty much true throughout history that the set piece battles are rare, because most of the time you only try to do a set piece battle if you're absolutely convinced you can win.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but I disagree with. I think we too quickly jumped to characterise it by raiding. I completely disagree on raiding being the main characteristic. It is definitely there, and it's there every year, and it is constantly in the background. I think that's a great description by Roel. But it's not, I don't think, the main characteristic. For me, it is about trying to consolidate what you have, whilst also trying to expand your control over various polis. So it's almost trying to create the most amount of friends you have. We see this especially in Athens.
It's not really friends, it's more like a racket.
Well, let's say friendly racket.
I think you could characterise it as posturing. That's the major,
To an extent, yeah. I think you're right.
The Spartan posture and the Athenian posture, and the importance of Pericles, obviously, in the Periclean strategy. I hadn't heard of the alternative words to the Periclean strategy, the island strategy. Let's take away blame from Pericles. That whole idea, that the reason it succeeds, and he's the man with the foresight, the pronoia, to see where it's going, and that when he dies, it falls apart, and Athenians sort of stop pursuing that policy with the same sort of vigour because they've lost the figurehead of that policy.
I disagree with that, because he would very we can't say, but Pericles was very unlikely to have supported the Pylos campaign that Demosthenes starts. It is very un-Periclean. But it was the one time where Sparta returned to Athens and say, fine, you've got 300 of our men, 180 actual Spartiates, we want peace right now. And the Athenians turn it down.
I think that's the thing, though. That's an un-Periclean strategy, and I think if Pericles had lived longer, you wouldn't have had that sort of...
Is it though? I mean, this is really something that I question, simply because, as we mentioned before, Pericles went out with a massive fleet to try and raid the Peloponnese. If he'd been given an opportunity like the Pylos campaign, would he have said no to it? Would he have rejected that opportunity? I don't know.
I don't think it was actually working for him, though. His whole strategy of raiding along the coast of Peloponnese is partly, I think, designed to actually convince the allies of Sparta to really... be looking to their own homelands, defending their own homelands, rather than going into the invasion force of, the annual invasion force of the Spartans. He's trying to draw them back to their homelands, and it doesn't necessarily work. So whether he would have kept going with that...
There's a great article in Historia a few years ago where somebody argued that the Periclean strategy is actually not defensive at all. Like, he's preserving Athens in his way by making it an island, but he's actually very aggressive in his campaigning around the Peloponnese with the intention of A, breaking Megara, and B, trying to get Argos to choose for Athens. And those two things are very, very smart strategic moves for them in trying to tip the balance of a conflict that would otherwise presumably be able to go on forever without having a decisive result.
I'd add one other factor, because I think those two are very interesting. But the other factor would be stopping Spartan, or more accurately Peloponnesian, support for rebellion in the empire. You especially see this at Mytilene on Lesbos, where... to counteract the rebellion there, Athens sends a fleet and an army, but also then raids the Peloponnese to neutralise the threat of Sparta reinforcing Mytilenean uprising. Which they fail, and Sparta characteristically send one man. But it's another factor.
Characteristically sit up.
Yes. But I suppose that's more the point. It's a sort of historical trap, isn't it? You look for one or two factors to create a neat answer, but there's so many different issues going on at the same time that are being solved by a single strategy.
That comes in partly with when Cocker is negotiating their alliance with Athens originally. They do mention, we didn't have anything to say against you when you put down that rebellion in Samos. So they are backing Athenian imperialism as part of their agreement of being allies.
Well, and jumping to Brasidas' campaign, if we can jump chronologically, one of the things that scared Athens so much was that Brasidas was so lenient. And it comes into this similar issue of the diplomatic and the political game. So like you were saying, Corcyra sort of playing up to basically we will overlook your imperialism. And Brasidas especially pushes this idea rather threateningly, but he does push this idea, well, we're not going to push imperialism on you, you're going to be completely free. If you'll buy that, you'll buy anything.
Well, this is originally the Spartan promise, right? This is how Thucydides says the Spartans went into the war saying we are going to set free all of the Greeks, give you all autonomy. And one of the reasons why the Athenians tried to keep the war going for a long time was that it increasingly showed that this was actually not what the Spartans were achieving at all, or even what they were trying to do.
The irony, of course, that in the Greco-Persian wars, that's what Athens had contributed, and yet now Athens had become the tyrant that needed to be that Greece needed to be freed from. So
yeah, but I mean the Spartans several times sort of sent a fleet into the Aegean during the Archidamian War already, but it achieved absolutely nothing. It didn't do what the fleets of the Decelean War managed to do, which was to cause widespread revolt against Athens and actually set free those cities. And so the Spartans were basically shown how the longer the war lasted, the more the Spartans were shown to fall short of their own promises, which works, of course, in Athens' favor, which is why they won.
Well, how did the war come to an end?
So we've mentioned earlier the campaign of Pylos, which basically involved a small fleet of Athenians that were on their way to Corcyra. They landed on a strip of land in Messenia and decided to build a fort there. The Spartans were very concerned over this because it was very close to their territory and it would allow the Helots of Messenia to flee towards this Athenian base. And so they decided to march out in force and try to dislodge the Athenians, who actually managed through some convoluted system to beat them in a naval battle, trap a couple of Spartans on an island, then attack those Spartans, capture them. They surrendered to the Athenians, and at that point they had 300 Spartan prisoners, of which, as we mentioned, about 180 were full Spartan citizens. And the Spartans couldn't bear this. They had to get those men back. So from that moment on, they were willing to negotiate. They were willing to make peace. This is in 425. But the Athenians, as you mentioned, weren't up for it because they thought at this point, we can get even more. Like, we are definitely winning now. We need to be able to push this as far as we can go before we're stuck and limited by a peace treaty. So they said no to the Spartans, and they decided to try and achieve more things. At which point the Spartans, as Owen was saying, they sent out Brasidas to the north to try and cause revolts against Athens in Thrace, which was very successful. The Athenians, meanwhile, tried to break the Boeotians by a joint attack, which failed completely at the battlefield of Delion. 1,000 Athenians were slaughtered. And at that point, when they were both losing the North Aegean part of their empire, and when the Boeotians, more powerful than ever, were on their borders, riling for more, screaming for blood, at that point the Athenians realized, actually, we should probably make that peace now. And that is duly what happened in 421.
And possibly the classic what if question, again from Facebook. We've mentioned we haven't really mentioned is that Pericles actually died, didn't he, in the plague in Athens? But would the outcome have been any different if he hadn't died?
As we mentioned earlier, it's difficult to say what exactly Pericles' strategy was and how he meant to continue fighting the war. So I'm not entirely sure that we can say, the war would have happened totally differently if he had still been in charge. It may have lasted longer. On the other hand, the Spartans may have gotten their new ideas and sent Brasidas out sooner. We really have no idea. I would think that things probably would have happened roughly along the same lines, that at some point something had to give. Somebody had to have a new idea to launch into this system. Otherwise, very slowly, either Athens or Sparta was going to get worn down by this financial strain of the war, to the point where they would simply say, okay, let's return to the status quo and consider it done.
Thucydides emphasises as well that Pericles is very patriotic in his stance over things, and after he dies, there's the generals that come after him are more self-obsessed and individualistic about their policies, and they're not really after the patriotism of Pericles. So that sort of brings about the change in strategy.
Well, I mean, this is very much what the story that Thucydides tells us, but the problem is it's very hard to point to that in the sources. I mean, he basically means that Cleon is bad and always bad all the time, and Cleon's an idiot, and Cleon. But who else is he talking about? Who are these other generals? I mean, when we're talking about the generals that are prominent in the later part of the Archidamian War, we're talking about Lamachus, who is generally considered quite a good general. He loses his life eventually in Syracuse. There's Nicias, who is very much considered a good general by Thucydides, even, generally a balanced character, not very adventurous, but generally, capable commander. There's Demosthenes, who is a very capable commander and very much able to think outside the box in the interest of Athens and in the clear and mitigated interest of Athens. So if you're looking at these prominent figures, and many of them were signatories of the Peace of Nicias, actually, in 41. If these are the generals that are supposed to be less patriotic and more selfish and bringing Athens to the brink of ruin, I really don't think that's even Thucydides' narrative would allow us to make that argument.
It's a lovely idea, isn't it, that Pericles was the only general. Each year he does things. It's very easy to talk about Pericles' strategy and Periclean ideas. Pericles was always part of a college of generals. That was how Athens was run. So he was never the lone commander. He may have been the most listened to, maybe, or the most influential of speakers, but he was never a lone commander.
I think that's also part of Greek framing. You can do the same thing in the Greco-Persian wars, that it's all Miltiades or Callisthenes, then it's all Themistocles. But again, they're boards of generals, and the historians choose to emphasize the individual. And the same thing happens in Thucydides. So it's in a way and again it goes back earlier. When you look at the faceless masses of the Trojan War, we focus on the heroes. So in many ways it's an influential aspect of poetry and historiography. But there's many cogs to the wheel.
Well, you still see that today also. I mean, when you talk about the United States, you talk about Obama did this or Obama did that. It's of course a little bit nonsensical.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. We're tied to it from a Greek origin, and it's continued throughout history.
It's not a Greek origin. It's just people used to live in small bands of hunter-gatherers, and we're still operating on that same level, basically, where you have to have just a few people that you can talk about and can keep in your memory, And as soon as you start making things more complex, people start losing track of the story. That's basically the whole thing.
Well, I think that our history, and especially military history, is the history of great men doing things. I mean, the same thing. Napoleon did lots of things. So did Wellington. Without their subordinates, those things would never have happened. But we focus on the individual, and that stretches all the way back to the ancient Greek.
Well, this is an interesting thing actually in Thucydides, that sometimes he makes it seem that it's the men, the common guys, who are making something happen. Like for instance, the fortification of Pylos. He says that they were stranded there because of a storm, and they just decided to fortify the place, and lo and behold, Athens has a winning advantage in the war, which we may or may not believe that, but he is telling the story saying, like, this is not some general's genius idea, this is actually the men just taking their own initiative because they're bored.
Yeah, but that comes across as more putting down Cleon as well, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of saying that he just stumbles into this victory that he then claims as his own later on. And by giving more of the credit to the general men, then it's taking away from him.
Well, it's Demosthenes who is in charge at the time, and Demosthenes also gets a lot of the credit in Thucydides for the eventual plan of attack on Sphacteria.
But it's interesting how pragmatic that battle, the evolution of Pylos and Sphacteria is very pragmatic and very this seems like a good idea, let's do this, which is very Athenian democracy. And many of the errors of the Athenian democracy of, hey, we've made this decision. Oh, no, that was a bad decision. Let's change our mind. Okay, we've changed our mind. Is very, typical. And in terms of the empowered Athenian voter, you can imagine that they would be very pro that sort of, hey, this is a good idea. Let's form a mini democracy and decide to do this. It seems to make sense, but
it's debatable how much an Athenian on military service felt a sense of personal empowerment versus communalism. What's really interesting about the fortification of Pylos is that they actually refused Demosthenes' first suggestion to do it. He first suggests, let's fortify here, and his fellow commanders laugh at him. So he goes, fine, I'll take it to the men, who then also laugh at him. And then it's only after a few days pass, and like Roel says, that boredom kicks in, that they actually ignore all orders that have been given to them at that point, and decide to fortify Pylos on their own, irrelevant of what the generals want. I personally prefer to see Pylos and Sphacteria as actually a joint force section of sieges, because then you get this idea of action and counteraction, and that's the easiest way, I think, to see that entire element, rather than some historians prefer to see it as Demosthenes' great grand plan, and everything was meant to happen. Whereas I see it a bit similar to yourself, Murray. It's almost like a series of bumbling mistakes that get capitalised on. It's that pragmatism of not just one man, but a group of men.
The ultimate mistake is the Spartans actually setting light to the brushwood, isn't it? I mean, ultimately exposing their own positions.
Thucydides makes that an Athenian having dinner. It's all very suspect, that bit. But yes, yeah, again, that idea of capitalism, whereas it could very easily have been pictured, and I actually know there's an article coming out soon on this that actually argues that Demosthenes planned that fire based on his experience in Aetolia. But for me, it's an accident. It's a cock-up that is then capitalised on very quickly. And it's that pragmatism and that adaptability that defines this period of warfare for me.
It's like the defeated general running to the front of his retreating forces, and that he's leading them in retreat. Yes. I was just going to comment on the the Athenian on campaign. There is evidence with the accounts of Socrates that Socrates seems to have had that reputation by the campaigns he's in, and there are accounts in the symposium of what he did on campaign and how impressed all of the other Athenian soldiers were. So there's glimpses in his case of the sort of the Athenianness of them is intact, even though they're subservient to a general or a commander. There's a sort of he's a great man, and he's a philosopher in Athens, and he indicates that by thinking about a question all night on guard duty, sort of that sort of thing.
No, Socrates is an interesting guy. What's interesting about you have what you actually have is the story of him pondering for, I think it's 12 hours, stood outside in what is presumably either camp or a siege. It's not actually stated. The men, it depends on how you translate the Greek, and I don't want to go too academic, but one of the more literal ways of translating the Greek is actually the men are ridiculing him for this. They're not in awe of him. They find it ridiculous, almost to the point of lunacy. The person who most commonly speaks well of him is the literary trope of Alcibiades, who of course was alleged to be his non-lover, if you read Plato thoroughly. It's a very confusing relationship. And as actually, I think is it in Laches, where he is mentioned again at Delium. And that's probably the only time you hear a general speak well of him. But again, this is Plato's own invention. But yeah, you do have his experiences at Potidaea, presumably, at the siege. Again, not stated, but presumably is. And at Delium, and again at Amphipolis. Which you'll notice, out of 3 of them, 2 of those are failures. Delium and Amphipolis. According
to this amazing comment here by Triremes, there's an article in the issue which argues that when he was at Potidaea, it must have been the defeat aspect of the retreat as well, that he was in the defeated wing. Simply because of the actions that he takes. But the other thing that this comment raises here is that and I've only thought about this subsequent to it, is that him standing out, with barely any clothes on and doing all the hardship stuff, that's the origins, I think, of the typical general. That when you read that about Alexander, and you read it about Hannibal, and you read it about Scipio, and all the way through to Montgomery and all these others, that it sort of seems to have its origins with Socrates, because he's doing all that stuff. Yeah, he's sharing the deprivations of the men, but he's
much
this
more
great
likely, I would say, it goes back to the Spartans, especially Agesilaus. I don't want to rain on your parade here, but I mean, this is later. That's true. I admit.
Socrates, yeah, Socrates predates it.
No, it's true, but I mean, this is very much sort of a habit that the Spartans like to present as being their own, and especially Xenophon says that this is essential to all forms of command in a Greek army, that you have to share the hardships of your men, otherwise you're never going to get their respect. And his example for that, of course, is Agesilaus, who rejects all the good food and only eats the simplest stuff and wears the simplest clothes and sleeps on the simplest bed, etc. I think that's very much where that comes from.
That would be Xenophon, the student of Socrates, then.
Well, it also goes back further than that. Oh, you think you can take me, but you can't, because
I'm
Pausanias at Plataea.
All you have to do is cut my string and my flight flies off, so it's so fine.
Just to interject on that, you also have two other issues. One of them is Phormio, the Athenian admiral, has the exact same reputation for doing this. And secondly, Socrates is never a general. He is only ever a hoplite of just standard rank.
But I mean, it also goes back to Pausanias at Plataea, who says, like, compare our meals and our tents and our equipment to that of the Persian camp that we just captured. Like, how did people as poor as us beat people as rich as that? So he's already counting on this trope, like, we are simple folk, especially Spartans, of course, pretending to be simple people, even though they're all loaded, as opposed to these decadent rich Persians.
Everything old is new again.
Sort of. You can imagine the same things being said by insurgents.
But I mean, it may well be that Xenophon obviously was influenced by Socrates on this. But I think a lot of these later examples, they were just reading their Xenophon, because he was very, very well respected in antiquity.
And it's even in the Cyropaedia. So.
One of the interesting things I always find there's two interesting things about Socrates' military career that's not always focused upon, but fascinating. One of them is that Xenophon barely mentions it, which if there's one of his students you'd expect to, it would be him. And the second thing is, out of all the things that Socrates is lampooned for, especially on stage, with the likes of Aristophanes' satires of him, they never go for his military record. He is never ever judged on his military record, which does create the idea that this isn't perhaps just Plato's over-exaggeration.
Well, it's also interesting that, in the defence, he only mentions Delium, Potidaea, and Amphipolis. He doesn't mention anywhere else that he would have served, and that the first one of those he was 37, so he could have served in the First Peloponnesian War as a 22-year-old. So there's his service, he's and I think in the Laches dialogue, that's where he's asked by prominent Athenian generals his opinion on military matters.
More specifically, he's asked about the education on military matters. There's a bit of debate as to whether or not he's there as a military expert or an educational expert, if you want to think of him like that. The question is, what is Plato actually talking about?
That whole anecdote of him defending Laches at the battle of that's fascinating.
It's a Delium, isn't it?
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, and again you have him. I forget if it's in that or in the Symposium, where he retreats in a walk with a death stare at the Thebans. All very hyperbolic.
The Symposium.
Oh, it is the Symposium, yeah. So you always at the back of your mind, you've got to ask the questions: why is Plato telling this story? What is he actually depicting? Socrates as a philosopher, which is ultimately what he's being spoken about. What he is famous for is his reserved nature and his fortitude, philosophically. So the fact that is reflected militarily is suspect. But on the same token, this is why it's interesting that no one else attacks him for his military record, and no one else questions it. So perhaps it's not as exaggerated as we might expect, but still, take it lightly.
I don't know, given that you mentioned that he was being ridiculed by the other men for his sort of stoic endurance of hardship at Potidaea, I mean, it seems like a welcome topic for comedy and satire, really.
It certainly does, because at the moment there's a movement to make Socrates a model for psychological endurance in warfare. There's a bit of a movement in the PTSD debate to use Socrates as this almost example, which is getting a little concerning, and I think a slight reassessment of his military career needs to come.
The article I'm writing is called "Hero and Defeat," but anyway, well, I won't go there. But that's all right. You've just shot down a couple of my arguments, but that's all right. I'll just rephrase them slightly. But I think, certainly in terms of the philosopher soldier, Epaminondas certainly buys into that, and certainly the later traditions about Epaminondas paint him in the same light as the philosopher soldier is the ideal. And Socrates is obviously mentioned, and within that, even though, as you say, Socrates never served anything more than as a general hoplite. As a hoplite, not a general hoplite, as a hoplite, until he's the board of 10 after Agonusai, and he's. There's
no evidence he was even a taxiarchoi So you're talking a lower level.
Well, he says at Arginuso that's the only time he ever had any kind of office of any kind. So we assume that he's just a hoplite.
There was a question on Facebook about lightening of the armour as well, I think.
Well, I think we can, add the shift to lighter troops begun at this time.
You certainly get the depictions of hoplites with their shield, their spear, their helmet, and very little armour at this period, which is either an expense thing or...
No, it's something that starts already in the late Archaic period, at the end of the 6th century, when you have bell-shaped cuirasses being slowly replaced by linen corselets, and then slowly but surely the linen corset also becomes optional in the second half of the 5th century BC. So it's like this long, where the amount of metal slowly disappears and gets shifted more towards cavalry folks using metal cuirasses.
So this argument was originally launched by Snodgrass and Anderson, and I thought it was universally accepted, but apparently it's still controversial. There are still people who argue that this lightening of the panoply never actually happened, that the depiction that you get often, especially at Athens, of hoplites wearing only the pilos helmet and a tunic, that is very much ideological. It's about the idea that the hoplite is a general citizen, and so you don't have to, you wouldn't dress him up in the best of his fineries, you just have to represent him as a common man going out to war.
Yeah, people who believe that are called idiots. No, no, it's the well. There is also archaeological evidence. I mean, you get at the sanctuaries after about 450 BC. It's the dedication of metal armor sort of slowly disappears, and also in art generally. Military subjects become less popular after 450 BC, more or less, and loads of people have said that, or some people have claimed that that's because the Athenians, who produced most of the art, of course, the vase paintings, were getting fed up with being exposed to warfare on a daily basis anyway, to also see that stuff being depicted on their pottery. And that's why they shifted towards mythological scenes, and maybe also they stopped dedicating armor at sanctuaries and that sort of stuff. No, but it's quite possible. I mean, it's still being discussed whether the Greeks really lightened their armor, or whether there was a particular subset of people who continued to wear heavy armor. Usually it's the idea that commanders would have worn more armor than regular soldiers and that sort of stuff. It is more complicated than what Snodgrass, etc., presented back in the day.
I mean, for me, it makes sense as a ranking system that your rear rankers don't need as much armor protection to be in the rear ranks as the front ranks do. But I don't know that that's anywhere.
No, though there is some evidence for the Corinthian helmet, for example, that after 450 BC it becomes extremely rare, but there is still a monument that dates to I think it's the mid 4th century BC, but I'm not quite sure now. I wrote it down somewhere, which is a monument that also shows Corinthian helmets. So they were either still known, possibly still used, maybe as heirlooms or something, or maybe still made, we don't really know, but they were rare, and as such they probably were used by only a very small subset of people.
And the funny thing is, I mean, we know from later sources, particularly speaking about the Hellenistic phalanx, that there was this really strong organization of troops where the best and the strongest are going to be in the front and the most reliable going to be at the rear. And Xenophon does recommend this, but there's no evidence of anyone actually doing it, except that the uragoi, the file closers, are only attested in the 10,000 and nowhere else. Even in Sparta, there was no such thing as a file closer. So the idea that you can arrange your phalanx according to what amount of armor each troop is wearing, it seems to be unknown to the Greeks. They may have done that in practice, but we have no evidence for it. So in theory, this idea works. You can have like a small number of men being heavily armored, and you put them, of course, in the front ranks. But in practice, there's just no evidence that that would happen. In fact, where the only descriptions that you get of the Spartan phalanx approaching is that it's all bronze, all red, which has been taken to suggest that the shields were covered in bronze, and they were wearing bronze helmets and possibly greaves, but then their red tunics would shine out as well. So the men at the front ranks who are showing you the front of the phalanx are actually not wearing body armor. So there is no real evidence or nothing to suggest that the men at the front would have been the ones who were still wearing full armor, and then towards the back they would get progressively more lightly armored.
It would have been typically Greek to have them all mixed in between. so that you wouldn't have a particular organization. You would have a heavily armored guy here, and then we'd have a guy wearing almost nothing there, and that would have been more typical. Because the Greeks were not very systematic, contrary to most to popular opinion.
You'd have the guy who just had his birthday, who just got given a new set, and then you'd have the other guy next to him wearing granddad's armor, and then the guy next to him wearing dad's armor. And,
precisely.
Yeah.
So also heirlooms were very important to the ancient Greeks. So it was, that would have happened too. So
I mean, that's the thing about a Corinthian helmet is, you can find a Corinthian helmet in an archaeological dig and still put it on your head, and it's still effective. So that's thousands of years later. So 50, 100. You could still use a Corinthian helmet with great effect. It would only just be a little bit tarnished, nothing like elbow grease and salt. So
you also have the other problem with this, which is twofold. One of them is that we have a lot of evidence that people are turning up, especially in Athens. They're turning up to their musters, to their call for levies, with a wide disparity of not only wealth but also equipment. So you will have this disparity within the ranks anyway. But you also have the issue, it's not concrete, but it's something that has been pushed by Van Wees. It's been recently pushed by Jason Crowley, which comes from the Catalogos, which is the system of the main system of recruitment Athens uses during the period, where it has a very systematic listing drawn from the 10 tribes that Athens is split up into, and possibly split down into the very demes, the very villages of Athens itself. So small lists were coming together, were accumulated of all men who were liable for service, and then from there they would then knock off people who had served recently, people who were injured, people who were too old or too maimed to fight, things like that. And then you create a catalogos or a catalogoi, in the plural, of anyone who was liable for this particular campaign. And it's argued by the likes of Christ, Van Wees, Crowley, that this catalogos was most likely accumulated by what was called the demarchos, basically like a village headman, if you want to call him that. And there's a good possibility that this was actually annotated, or at least by the time it got to the tribal level with the taxiarchoi, he was then suggesting people to the strategos, who was the general, the person in charge of the levy itself. So he would actually end up with almost an annotated list of who to take, which would not be related to how well dressed he would be or how well equipped he was. It would be his reputation and how he was as a man. So oddly enough, your best fighter, who you'd want as your promarchos, or your frontline man, could be one of your least equipped, in theory. Just because of the experience he had and the capabilities that he's shown in his own service. It's not often you get to geek out on Greek military infrastructure. It's more of a Roman thing.
So you don't get the picture of don't pick him. He's got that ugly 470s armor with the flares. Don't put him in the front rank.
You actually do in Plutarch's Phocion. You basically do get that at a muster. Basically his enemy from the assembly turns up and he just berates and mocks him in public and says that he's basically he's too lame to serve, go away.
You can just take your leather cuirass and you can go.
Oh boy.
Right, chaps, I think we'll leave it there. I'd like to thank Josho, Murray, Mark, Owen and Roel. In the next episode we'll be talking Hellenistic Egypt. So don't forget to keep your eyes peeled on Facebook for the call for questions. Just search for Ancient Warfare Magazine. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.